Hi guys, thanks for joining Future Forward, the podcast where I help you navigate this ever-changing world. And in this episode, I want to talk about guilt, right? So when we think of guilt, we think of, that feeling of negativity or the feeling that arises when you feel remorseful for doing something bad to a person, to another person. But essentially what guilt is that negative emotion that arises within you when you feel that you've deprived someone of something they wanted, right? And now there's two types of guilt that people can experience, right? So the first being the negative guilt. The negative guilt is where you feel guilty for depriving someone of something that they may have needed at their expense for your own benefit. Right, so it's essentially you depriving someone because of selfish reasons, right? That is a negative guilt. Then there's a positive guilt, and the positive guilt is where you feel guilty for depriving someone of something they wanted because it was detrimental to you, right? Or it would come at, a personal cost to you. So you decided to choose yourself, right, over them. You decided to choose self-preservation over their needs, right? And that is positive guilt. Regardless, I hear a lot of people trying to figure out why people don't feel guilty about doing certain things. And the reason for that is it's very pointless to expect someone else to feel guilty for doing something negative to you, because everyone's DRS is different. Now, this is a term I came up with to describe the differences or the difference in the scale of guilt. And I'll explain what it is. So the DRS is your deed rating system, right? This is the system that gauges what actions you feel guilty about, right? And this is developed over time from childhood, right? From the experiences you have in your community, in your environment, from the parenting style you're exposed to, right? So if you grew up in a very rough environment, right? A very abusive environment that was void of love or any sort of positive reinforcement by, figures such as parents or other people that you looked up to, then chances are you're going to be on the negative end of the DRS scale, where it's going to take a lot more for you to feel guilty about doing something, right? It's going to take a much bigger offense for you to start feeling guilty than another person, right? And for example, if you're on the other end of the spectrum and you grew up in a very sheltered environment where, there was a lot of love, there was a lot of compassion, there was a lot of, emotional fulfillment and love within the home, right? Or within the environment that you grew up in, then you're going to be on the positive end of the spectrum, and you might be at the extreme end of that spectrum, which is also not a good thing, right? And I'll explain why. If you're on the far end of the positive spectrum, right, you end up being what people call a people pleaser, right? You end up being one of those people that feels guilty for almost anything, for depriving anyone of almost anything, and you're more likely to decide to agree to people's demands at your own expense, right? That's where that people-pleasing energy can come from if you're on that end of the spectrum, right? But if you're on the very far negative end of the spectrum, you're less likely to feel guilty about a lot of things, right? Things that most of society would see as, worthy of guilt, right? So that's where you end up finding people like serial killers. That's where you end up finding people like the pedophiles, people, sexual offenders, people who beat their wives and all of this abuses, right? These are people that feel very little guilt. And this is coming from how they grew up, right? Seeing what was imposed on them and seeing how those people did not feel guilty for imposing so much hurt or, a lack of love towards them. And as a result, they grow up to become people who do not show remorse when, they hurt other people, right? So after some time, society comes along, right, and draws a line right in the middle of that spectrum where they essentially decide what is a socially acceptable level of guilt to experience, right? And this is where now we're made to look at things and, expected to feel guilty because that is what society has deemed to be the medium, right? That is what society has deemed to be worthy of guilt, right? So if you're one of those people that's trying to make someone else feel guilty, or trying to figure out why someone doesn't feel guilty for whatever reason, instead of, bashing them down for it, maybe it's good to look at a different perspective of it and actually, understand that it could be the way they grew up, what they did to you is not worthy of guilt based on how they grew up, right? And that's why they may not be, exhibiting any remorse for what they did, right? That's not something to bash them for. That is just how they are. That is how they were programmed as they grew up. You were programmed in a much different way where there are certain things that, the moment you do something that is remotely negative, you start to feel guilty for, right? You may have grown up in a healthy environment, but that is not everyone's experience, right? And I think the biggest thing with guilt that makes guilt itself feel as painful or as uncomfortable as being the victim or being the recipient of the offense is that guilt causes you to look within. It forces you to go into a state of introspection where now you're forced to acknowledge a self-fulfilling, bias about yourself, right? You're forced into a situation where you have to look at yourself and realize that you may not be the person you have been telling people you are, or you may not be the person you have been telling yourself you are based on, the actions that you have just, displayed, right? So then that is the difficult part. And what comes after that is, a deep felt level of guilt that comes from trying to understand who you are as a person, trying to understand who you really are if the version of you that you were telling people has been proven wrong, right? Has been proven to not be accurate, right? And this causes people into, a state where, they start to lose that self-love because, they might start to feel like they are actually not a great person. They are not as good as they thought they would be. They are seen by other people in a negative light, right? They start to think that other people have been viewing them in this way the entire time while they have been in an illusion of being a good person, right? So then there's a bit of an internal conflict that then takes place, right? And then creates a sense of an identity crisis, right, within a person. And guilt itself can be one of the leading causes for people to have self-esteem issues because you no longer know who you really are. You're not confident with who you say you are because when other people see you, you're afraid now that they see someone different, right? Because you weren't able to see that person that caused that offense that made you guilty, right? So now you don't know exactly what other people are seeing of you, right? And you become very more closed off, right? From society, from people, because you're afraid of the feedback you might get and where that might take you, right? Or whether it might throw you back into a state of introspection again. And, a whole mental cycle starts to take over that just leads you to a very depressive state, right? So it is important to, take some time to go somewhere in isolation, go on a trip by yourself and really get to know who you are, right? Really get to understand yourself at the core, really get to understand your motives, your perceptions of life, your impulses, and how your mind actually processes information and how you give information to other people, right? This is all I have for you today, guys. I will see you on the next episode. Thanks for watching.